He thought he knew his wife, but everything changed when he discovered the shocking truth. As new secrets emerged and old betrayals resurfaced, the man found himself on the edge. He wasn't just learning about the betrayal. He had become part of a larger game with stakes higher than he could ever imagine. Will he find justice, or will he drown in his revenge? This is a story of betrayal no one saw coming and vengeance that will leave you speechless. Don't miss what happens next. I stood outside the nightclub, staring at the bright neon signs reflecting off the wet asphalt. Inside, the bass pounded, shattering the night silence. Lemuria said she worked here, but she never mentioned what exactly she did. Bartender? Manager? Waitress? I had asked her dozens of times, and each time, she dodged the question. It's just a job, love, nothing special. She would smile, kiss me, and quickly change the subject, but I didn't believe her. I saw how she was changing. Her perfume had become more expensive. Her phone was always on silent. Her night shift stretched until morning. I could just go inside and see for myself, but something held me back. I took a deep breath of the cold air, clenched my fists, and took a step forward. 3 weeks ago, everything was different. How was your day? I asked as Lemuria walked into the kitchen. Great. She unscrewed the cap of a water bottle and took a few sips. There was a lot of work at the club. I'm exhausted. Still not going to tell me what exactly you do there? She smiled, leaned in, and kissed me on the cheek. You don't need to know that, Mason. Why not? Because it doesn't matter. Her eyes gleamed with a challenge, and I felt something tighten inside me. Lemuria, are you hiding something from me? You trust me, don't you? She pressed herself against me, her fingers sliding down my neck. I knew what she was doing, distracting me, just like she always did when I brought up this topic. I wanted to believe nothing bad was happening, but her unwillingness to tell the truth felt like a knife in my back. A week later, I decided to dig deeper. Where were you last night? At work. You come home at 3 in the morning, sometimes even later. Clubs close at 2. Lemuria shrugged. We stayed late, cleaning up. You're not a cleaner. Of course not. Then what are you? She smiled, but her eyes were cold. You're so cute when you're jealous. This isn't jealousy. It's logic. Lemuria ran her finger along the rim of her glass. If you don't stop, this could end badly, Mason. I froze. Is that a threat? It's advice. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked into the bedroom, leaving me with the feeling that I had gotten too close to something dangerous. Now, standing outside the club, I finally made my decision. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of alcohol, perfume, and smoke hit me. People danced, drank, laughed. 2 men worked behind the bar. A woman in a sparkling costume performed on stage. I walked through the room, scanning every face. Lemuria was nowhere to be seen. But then I heard a familiar voice. I turned sharply. She was there, on the VIP balcony. She stood in front of a man in an expensive suit, laughing and saying something to him. He leaned in toward her, touching her hand. My heart pounded in my chest. Lemuria knew I was looking for answers, and she did everything to make sure I wouldn't get them. But this time, I wouldn't stop. I clenched my fists. In front of me, Lemuria. She leaned closer to this man, smiling at him the way she used to smile at me. The man whispered something in her ear, and she laughed. This was more than just friendly conversation. I took a step forward, but suddenly, someone grabbed my arm. Don't. I turned my head. In front of me stood the bartender, a young guy in a black shirt, watching me closely. Sorry, who are you? I asked coldly. Better not make a scene here. If you're who I think you are, you won't like what you find out. What do you mean? The bartender glanced at the VIP balcony, where Lemuria leaned in even closer to the man. If you want the truth, don't do anything stupid. Sit down. I wanted to yank my arm free, walk up to her, and demand an explanation, but something in his eyes made me reconsider. I nodded. Fine. Talk. We sat at the bar. The bartender poured me a whiskey. She said she had a jealous husband. So that's you? She said. She had a husband? He smirked. She says a lot of things. Don't play games with me. Who is that man? I don't know names. But he comes here often. Pays her well. Pays for what? The bartender held my gaze. You're not as clueless as you're pretending to be, are you? I gripped my glass so hard my fingers turned white. I want to know everything. He sighed and leaned his elbows on the bar. Your Lemuria isn't a waitress, a bartender, or a manager here. Then what does she do? He smiled. Let's just say some men are willing to pay for her attention. The whiskey burned my throat, but I felt nothing. You're lying. Why would I lie? He nodded toward the VIP area. See for yourself. I looked up at the balcony. Lemuria placed her hand on the man's chest. He leaned in, whispered something to her, and she laughed again. A dull ringing filled my head. I need to talk to her. Your choice. But not here. Where? Wait for her at the back exit. She always leaves through there. I stood up. The bartender grabbed my arm again. Do yourself a favor. Don't start yelling. I yanked my arm free and walked silently toward the back exit. I stood in the shadows, waiting. Minutes passed. I imagined her sitting there, laughing, touching his hand. My nails dug into my palm. Finally, the door opened. Lemuria stepped out, talking on the phone. No, it was easy. He didn't even doubt it, she said to someone and laughed. All right, see you tomorrow. She put her phone into her purse and was about to leave when I stepped forward. Who were you talking to? She stopped abruptly. Mason. Yes, Lemuria. She blinked as if she couldn't believe I was there. What are you doing here? You tell me. What exactly do you do here? She stayed silent. Answer me. Lemuria bit her lip. This isn't the place to talk about it. Fine. Tell me at home. I can't. Why not? She stepped closer and placed a hand on my chest. You trust me, don't you? The same words she had said before. But now, they sounded different. I grabbed her wrist and moved her hand away. You have a choice. Either you tell me now, or I find the answers myself. She looked at me. If you find out, there won't be anything left for us to go back to. What do you mean? She smiled, but there was something like pity in her eyes. You're not ready to hear the truth, Mason. Try me. She took a step back. Not tonight. Lemuria turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the darkness. The next day, I decided to act. During the day, while she was still asleep, I took her phone. Locked, but I knew her password. A message from an unknown number. Tomorrow at 11 p.m. Bring what you promised. I took a screenshot and sent it to myself. Questions swirled in my head. What had she promised? What was she doing at 11 p.m.? I decided to find out myself. The next night, I parked behind the club and waited. At 10:55 p.m., the back door opened and Lemuria stepped out. She walked away from the main entrance. I followed her, staying in the shadows. She reached a black SUV. The door opened, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. Do you have what I asked for? He asked. Lemuria nodded and handed him a small black box. These are all the records you wanted. The man opened the box, checked the contents, and nodded with satisfaction. Good. You know what to do next. She sighed. I know. You'll get your money tomorrow. He got into the car and drove away. I stepped out of the shadows. Can I know what that was? Lemuria spun around sharply. Mason? Yes, it's me. She nervously ran a hand through her hair. You were following me? I asked you directly, and you chose to play games. What was that? It means nothing. What did you give him? Lemuria pressed her lips together. It's better if you don't know. I already saw everything, Lemuria. She stayed silent. Tell me the truth. She looked me in the eyes. If I tell you, you'll never see me again. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you find out the truth, everything will change for you. I want to know. Lemuria stepped closer and whispered. Then come to the club tomorrow at midnight. But not as a guest. You'll see everything with your own eyes. I stood there, not knowing what to say. Lemuria smiled. Think carefully about whether you really want this. She walked away, leaving me alone. Tomorrow at midnight, I would know the truth. But was I ready for it? I stood in front of the club doors, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Lemuria had told me to come at midnight. She said that after this, nothing would ever be the same. But she didn't know one thing. I didn't come alone. I had tracked down the bartender I spoke to last time. His name was Nick. He agreed to help me, but on one condition. I couldn't interfere until I saw everything for myself. "Ready?" he asked, handing me a black uniform for the club staff. I nodded, pulling on the shirt. "Let's go." We entered through the staff entrance. The hallways smelled of alcohol and smoke. Girls in short dresses passed by without even glancing at me. "Where is she?" I asked. "She's already there." "Wait." Nick led me into a small room filled with monitors. It was the security room, where they watched over the entire club. "Look." I stared at the screen. On one of the monitors, I saw Lemuria. She was sitting at a table in the VIP section. Across from her was the same man I had seen last time. What are they doing? Wait a minute. I watched closely. The man took a thin black folder out of his pocket and placed it in front of Lemuria. She slowly opened it, flipped through a few pages, and suddenly stopped. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" I heard her voice through a hidden microphone. The man leaned in closer. "This is your problem, Lemuria." She swallowed. "That's not true." "It is. And if you don't want this information to go public, you'll have to do one more job for me." I tensed up. "What are they talking about?" Nick shook his head. "I don't know, but it looks bad." I turned my gaze back to the screen. Lemuria clenched her fists. "Is this blackmail? Call it whatever you want. But if you refuse, this file will end up in your husband's hands." My mouth went dry. "What's in the file?" Nick shook his head again. "We need to get closer." We left the room and slipped into the VIP section. I hid behind a column, trying to hear something. Lemuria was gripping the edges of the table nervously. "You have no right." "You know I do." "What do you want?" The man smiled. "You already know." She bit her lip. "Is this the last time?" "If you do everything right, yes." She closed her eyes. "Fine." The man stood up and left, leaving the folder on the table. Lemuria grabbed it and suddenly stood. I stepped out of the shadows. "Lemuria." She flinched and turned to me. "Mason, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." She clutched the folder tightly in her hands. "You weren't supposed to come." "What are those documents?" She took a step back. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" She remained silent. I reached out my hand. "Let me see." She shook her head. "No." I yanked the folder from her hands and opened it. What I saw made me stagger. They were photographs. Photographs of Lemuria and me. At different stages of our relationship. Our wedding. Dinners at home. Even the moment I gave her the bracelet on our anniversary. Next to each photo were notes. Names. Dates. I looked up. "What is this?" Lemuria looked like she was about to be sick. "It's a dossier." "On who?" She sighed. "On you, Mason." I was at a loss for words. "What?" "They've been watching you for a long time." I couldn't believe it. "Who?" She looked away. "You don't want to know." I gripped the folder tighter. "Tell me the truth." She looked at me. "If I tell you, you'll regret it." I stepped closer. "Say it." She leaned in and whispered 3 words in my ear. I felt the blood drain from my face. Everything I knew shattered into pieces. I felt sick. Sick from her words, from everything I had just learned. I looked at her. She was silent, as if waiting to see what I would do next. "Is this some kind of joke?" My voice cracked. Lemuria shook her head. "I wish it was." I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I knew about her, about us, suddenly looked completely different. They used me? She didn't answer. "Damn it, Lemuria. They were spying on me." She closed her eyes. "It's not what you think." "Then what?" She didn't have time to answer. Heavy footsteps sounded behind us. I turned around. 3 men in black jackets were moving toward us. "Run!" Lemuria hissed, grabbing my hand. We bolted forward, rushing through the club's corridor. The people around us didn't even notice. The music drowned out everything. "Where?" I yelled, leaping down the stairs. "This way." She veered to the side and shoved open the emergency exit door. We ran out into a dark alley. A loud crash echoed behind us. They were following. "Get in the car." I didn't think twice. I sprinted toward my car, yanked open the door. Lemuria jumped into the passenger seat. I started the engine. The men burst onto the street. Gas. The tires screeched as I sped off, leaving only the sound of rubber tearing against asphalt. Are you going to explain? I glared at her as we merged onto the highway. She was breathing hard. It was inevitable. What was inevitable? That they would find out I told you the truth. And now they want to kill us? Lemuria looked out the window. Not kill. Then what? She was silent. I slammed on the brakes. Get out. She slowly turned her head. What? Get out of the car. Mason. Get out. Lemuria didn't move. If I leave, they'll find me first. That's not my problem anymore. Please. For the first time, her voice sounded truly afraid. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. You have 1 minute. Tell me everything. She took a deep breath. They wanted to use you. For what? For access. Access to what? Lemuria slowly lifted her eyes. Your company. I froze. What company? The one you don't even know you have. A chill ran down my spine. Explain. She clenched her fists. It's about your father. A ringing filled my ears. My father died 10 years ago. Lemuria looked straight at me. Are you sure? Mason hit the gas, but his hands were shaking. Everything he thought he knew about his life was crumbling. Lemuria remained silent, staring out the window. She had known this for a long time. She had lied. She had manipulated him. He thought back to his father's funeral, the closed casket, the emptiness after his death. And now he was being told it was all a lie? That was impossible. But if it was true, he abruptly turned off the highway, pulling into a dark alley. He needed to think. But he didn't have time. Lemuria was already reaching for the door, ready to run. Mason grabbed her wrist just in time. She jerked, but it was too late. He saw it in her eyes, fear. She was no longer in control. He needed to think. He needed answers. If his father was alive, where was he? Why had he stayed silent all these years? And most importantly, what exactly was he in control of? Lemuria lowered her head, her breathing steadying. She understood. There was no escaping this. Mason opened the glove compartment and pulled out his phone. He dialed the only number that might give him some answers. He didn't know what the person on the other end would say, but he knew one thing. After this, nothing would ever be the same. Mason sat in the dark alley, staring at the road stretching endlessly before him. His heart was beating faster, and his mind struggled to piece together the shocking revelations he had just heard into a logical order. Lemuria, the woman he had spent several years of his life with, now felt like a stranger. Everything he had known about her, about their relationship, no longer made sense. His father, whom he had lost decades ago, now seemed to be alive. He pondered what it all meant for him and why Lemuria, the woman he had once considered the love of his life, had lied to him at every step. She sat beside him, staring out the window. Mason couldn't tell if she felt even the slightest guilt for everything that had happened. She looked cold, almost indifferent, and that only irritated him more. He turned to her, but she didn't move. Mason knew she had no answer to his questions. Instead, her demeanor was unyielding, as if she was simply waiting for the end. Mason stepped on the gas, and the car lurched forward again. They sped down the road, but Mason couldn't shake off everything he had just learned. He remembered the day he buried his father. Every moment of that day had felt so real, so true, and now it was all shattering into tiny pieces. If his father was alive, what else were these people hiding? Lemuria, was she really just an actress in someone else's game? She suddenly turned to him, and an expression appeared on her face that Mason couldn't quite decipher. She said a few words he couldn't hear over the roar of the engine. Mason glanced at her, but she lowered her head again as if trying to hide from him. Why was she acting like this? He didn't know if she had felt any emotion when she revealed this terrifying truth to him. Was this simply a role she played, one she could no longer shake off? Mason understood that he needed to know more. He couldn't stop now, so he decided to turn into a dark alley, hoping to calm down and collect his thoughts. Stopping the car, he turned to Lemuria. In her gaze, he saw the same fear he had noticed in her eyes when they left the club. But now, It wasn't the kind of fear that could be controlled. It was fear for her own life, fear that she knew more than she had let on. She was no longer sure what awaited her next. Lemuria looked at Mason with an expression that made his heart sink. Not only had she lied to him, but she had likely put him on the brink of disaster. He felt betrayed, destroyed, yet he still couldn't believe that her role in all of this was so significant. Why hadn't she told him sooner? How long had she been a part of this grand scheme? Mason no longer knew how to trust people, how to live in a world where everything could be just a game. Meanwhile, from the depths of the dark alley, heavy footsteps echoed again. Mason froze. Every nerve in his body tensed. It was the same men in black jackets. They didn't stop and were now approaching them faster. Mason glanced at Lemuria. She tried to shrink behind the seat, as if that would help. What do they want? Mason thought, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He realized that the longer they stayed here, the better chance their pursuers had to catch them. He started the engine and sped off without thinking where exactly he was going. As they raced through the city streets, Lemuria glanced at him again with a cold stare. Mason realized she no longer had the right to be a part of his life. He decided to handle everything on his own. He wasn't ready to hear the truth she had kept from him. He wasn't ready to listen to her explanations. But this was too important. He had to find answers, no matter what they were. Suddenly, their pursuers disappeared. It was too quiet, and Mason felt his heartbeat quicken. Why had they stopped the chase? Was this a trap? Or did they have other plans? He looked at Lemuria, and her eyes dropped to the floor, as if trying to hide something. Mason knew this wasn't just a random pursuit. He stared into her eyes and felt the growing chasm between them, one that could never be bridged. And then, suddenly, it became clear. This entire situation was only the beginning of a much bigger game, one whose rules he had yet to understand. Mason pressed the gas pedal again, and the car shot forward. There was no time for hesitation. He only trusted himself and his own understanding of this game, which had turned out to be far more complex than he had ever imagined. And with each passing moment, he was getting closer to the truth. Mason turned the wheel sharply and pulled into a parking lot. His heart was pounding, and his mind pulsed with questions he had no answers to. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and quickly dialed the number of the detective he had hired a few weeks ago. Lemuria, sitting silently beside him, watched with a cold expression. "What happened, Mason?" The detective's voice came through the receiver. "It's not what we thought." Mason hesitated for a second, feeling something inside him tremble. "She's not who she seemed to be. I don't trust her, but I can't reveal everything yet. You're not alone. Hang in there." The detective's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Mason tapped the screen and ended the call. Now, he faced an even bigger dilemma. Should he keep Lemuria in his life when he felt this was more than just betrayal? Was there a deeper purpose behind it all, one he had failed to recognize before? She was part of something bigger, and he could feel it in every fiber of his being. He couldn't understand why she was so cold, why her gaze no longer carried the warmth that had once captivated him. Mason turned to her, but before he could speak, something unsettling caught his attention. The silence. She wasn't looking at him, and suddenly, something small yet crucial changed in her expression. He noticed a tiny movement, her fingers clutching her phone, which she quickly hid when he lifted his gaze. Mason felt like he had just missed something vital, something that could change everything. He stood up and approached her, leaning in to glance at the phone screen. Lemuria instantly recoiled, her eyes trembling. Mason couldn't understand why she was reacting so strongly to such a small thing. "Are you trying to hide something from me?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. She didn't answer, but her silence was louder than words. Mason turned toward the door, blocking her way to escape, and said, "I'm watching you. And what you're doing, it's not just betrayal. It's something more." Her lack of response confirmed his suspicions. Lemuria was involved in something much bigger than he could have imagined. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was the detective. Mason immediately picked it up and pressed accept. What he heard next split his world in two. "Mason, I just found out something. Lemuria, she's not just cheating on you. She's working for someone. And this isn't just a business deal. It's more than you can imagine." I found her connections to a serious syndicate. Mason sank into the seat. His mind couldn't process these words. He sat in silence, trying to comprehend everything he had just learned. Lemuria was working for a syndicate? How was that possible? She set up your betrayal, Mason. It was part of the plan. And it wasn't just a mistake. Everything was orchestrated for one purpose. Mason couldn't believe it, but the fact remained. He looked at Lemuria, at her face, which had suddenly turned even colder. What have you done? This wasn't a question anymore. It was a challenge. And then she spoke. You wouldn't understand, Mason. I have always been a part of this. You were just a tool. And this isn't betrayal. This was my mission. Mason felt everything collapsing around him. She hadn't just lied to him. She was part of a grand scheme, one where he didn't even know his own role. But before he could ask more, Lemuria brushed back her hair and lifted her head. Mason, there's one more thing you need to know. You are not alone. Everyone you've met along the way is connected. And I was just one piece in this grand chess game. Mason froze. All these months, he had been playing a game he didn't even know existed. Lemuria wasn't just a woman in his life. She was the one who had been leading him to this moment. And then, just as he felt completely lost, the parking lot door opened, and the detective stood at the entrance. Mason didn't have time to understand why he was there, but everything fell into place when he saw the documents in the detective's hands. Documents that confirmed one thing. Lemuria wasn't just a traitor. She was part of a plan that had been in the works for years, and every decision Mason had made, every step, had led to this moment. Mason, you are not who you think you are, the detective said. Mason sat in the car, holding his phone, but his thoughts wouldn't let him rest. He reread the message he had just received and felt his chest tighten with shock. The phrases were short, but they changed everything he knew. Lemuria. She was part of something big, much bigger than just betrayal, and this plan was already in motion. Stay in touch. Everything will become clear. The detective's text read. Suddenly, the car door opened, and Lemuria stood before him. There was no regret in her eyes, no fear, only confidence, which made Mason feel just how deeply everything had shifted. You know everything? Her voice was calm, but that didn't help. Mason remained silent, already feeling that his entire reality was crumbling. What does all this mean, Lemuria? His voice barely reached her ears. Lemuria raised an eyebrow. You don't understand, Mason. This isn't betrayal. It was part of the plan. I had to become your wife to be part of something bigger. And you became part of this game yourself. Mason heard the words but couldn't believe them. All these years with Lemuria, all those moments that had felt so real, had just been part of a grand chess match. He grabbed her wrist, refusing to believe his own eyes. What is this game, Lemuria? What are you trying to do? But she just smiled. It's not just a game. This is our reality. Do you know how many times I've looked at you and known that it had to be this way? You are part of a bigger scheme. Mason let go of her hand, feeling helpless. Something in her words made him start doubting. He began recalling all the signs that had once seemed insignificant. What if this had all been a plan? What if he himself was just a piece in someone else's game? Lemuria stepped out of the car without saying another word. Mason couldn't just leave it at that. He got behind the wheel and drove after her, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. She led him to a remote warehouse where, as it turned out, everything had begun. And it was here, among the empty walls, that Mason learned everything he needed to know. Inside the warehouse, there were people. They were dressed in black, and each of them held documents. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay an old laptop. Lemuria walked toward the table, and all eyes were on her. Mason felt as though he had fallen into a trap with no way out. You didn't believe I was that simple? Lemuria said, turning to him. You were just a tool for us. Now you'll be a part of what we're building. Mason looked at her. He didn't understand. All these years, all these emotions, all those moments of intimacy. Was it all just a plan? But what was this plan? What were they trying to build? And then the detective appeared. Mason wasn't ready for this twist. He realized that from the very beginning, he had been nothing more than a part of a game they had pulled him into. The detective laughed when he saw that Mason had finally fallen into the trap. Mason, Did you think this was just a personal conflict? In reality, you turned out to be part of something bigger. We manipulate people to get what we need. Mason felt like a puppet being controlled. He looked at Lemuria, at the detective, and realized that his life had been controlled by them. Everything he had aspired to didn't matter. His entire struggle was just part of their game. But Lemuria wasn't as she seemed. A shadow of doubt appeared in her eyes. Mason saw it and felt the last spark of hope ignite in his heart. "Did you think I was betraying you?" Lemuria asked, her voice much softer. "But in reality, you became part of our plan even before we met. And now that everything has been revealed, I have to choose, you or us." Mason was ready for any answer, but it turned out to be completely different from what he had expected. Lemuria, in fact, had her own plans. She wasn't just a traitor. She was part of a bigger alliance. And this alliance was just beginning to unravel. But Mason understood one important thing. He wasn't just a player in someone else's game. He had his own strength. And maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart them all. And at that moment, when everything seemed decided, Mason turned around, dialed a number on his phone, and said just a few words, "I know what to do. Come tomorrow." Mason didn't just become a player again. He became the leader of this game. And now everything depended on him. What would you do in Mason's place when you found out that your whole life had been part of a large manipulation?